For decades, America called itself the land of opportunity. But behind the headlines and political slogans, something was quietly breaking. The middle class, the engine that built the world's largest economy, is collapsing. Wages frozen, costs exploding, debt replacing income, wealth evaporating. And while most people blame inflation, globalization, or politics, the truth is far darker, far deeper, and far more dangerous. Because this collapse did not happen overnight. It happened in silence, one household at a time, one debt at a time, one generation at a time. Today, we uncover the hidden forces that hollowed out America's middle class and why the consequences will reshape the entire world. For decades, the American middle class was considered the backbone of the world's most powerful economy, a symbol of stability and upward mobility. But behind the nostalgic image of suburban homes, steady wages, and predictable career paths, a slow, structural decline was already taking shape. The illusion of prosperity hit a fundamental shift. The economic engine that once propelled millions into security was weakening, its foundation eroded by forces that few recognized in time. The golden age that followed the Second World War, when manufacturing boomed, wages grew, and higher education became widely accessible, began fading quietly in the late 20th century, long before policymakers acknowledged the change. What emerged in its place was a fragile and uneven economy, increasingly unable to support the broad middle class that had once defined the nation. The transformation began with globalization. As corporations sought cheaper labor abroad, entire industries that had anchored American middle-class life shifted overseas. Factories closed across the Midwest, jobs moved to Asia and Latin America, and millions of workers found themselves competing in a global labor market that operated on vastly different wage scales. Economists noted that while production costs fell, the benefits flowed largely to corporate profits and shareholders rather than to workers themselves. The shift hollowed out regions once known for stable manufacturing employment, leaving communities struggling with unemployment, declining wages, and shrinking local tax bases. The economic wounds were long-lasting, and many areas have still not recovered, despite decades of attempted revitalization. At the same time, technological change accelerated the transition. Automation replaced countless jobs in manufacturing, logistics, and even service industries. Machines and software became cheaper than human labor, and companies adapted quickly. Analysts reported that automation accounted for a significant portion of job losses, once blamed solely on globalization. While technological progress created new high-skilled jobs, the number of accessible middle-income positions continued to shrink. Workers without advanced education were pushed into lower-wage roles, contributing to a growing sense that the American dream, once grounded in effort and opportunity, no longer applied to the majority. The weakening of labor unions further intensified the decline. During the mid-20th century, unions played a crucial role in securing higher wages, healthcare benefits, and workplace protections. But by the turn of the century, union membership had fallen dramatically as corporate lobbying, legal shifts, and economic restructuring reduced collective bargaining power. With weaker unions, wages stagnated even as productivity increased. Researchers observed that while American workers were producing more value than ever before, their paychecks did not reflect that growth. Corporations captured a rising share of national income, while the share going to labor fell to historic lows. Economic statistics reveal the scale of the shift. Median household income, adjusted for inflation, grew only marginally over several decades, while living costs rose sharply. Housing prices escalated in nearly every major metropolitan area. Education costs soared, leaving families burdened with long-term debt. Healthcare expenses increased at rates far exceeding wage growth. Analysts found that by the early 21st century, a majority of Americans reported struggling with unexpected expenses, and a significant portion lived paycheck to paycheck. These conditions represented a stark contrast to the financial stability that once characterized the nation's middle class. International comparisons highlight how unusual the American trajectory has become. While many developed countries also faced economic challenges, several maintained stronger wage growth and social safety nets that protected middle-income households from severe financial strain. The United States, by contrast, increasingly relied on consumer debt to sustain household spending. Credit cards, student loans, auto loans, and mortgages became essential tools for maintaining living standards. Economists warn that this reliance on debt masked deeper structural issues and created vulnerabilities that could amplify future downturns. The political consequences of the middle class's decline became evident in national discourse. Public frustration over economic stagnation fueled polarization and distrust in institutions. Debates over trade, immigration, automation, and inequality intensified as Americans sought explanations for their financial struggles. Politicians across the ideological spectrum attempted to address the issue, but structural problems proved resistant to policy solutions. Many regions continued to experience economic deterioration, despite government programs aimed at revitalization. News reporting further exposed the disparity between perception and reality. Investigations revealed that corporate profits reached record highs, while wage growth for most workers remained sluggish. Analysts pointed out that the wealth gap between the nation's richest households and the median family widened dramatically, with the top fraction controlling a growing share of national wealth. Housing affordability crises made headlines in cities from Los Angeles to New York, where middle-income workers could no longer afford to live near their jobs. Stories of families working multiple jobs yet unable to achieve financial stability became increasingly common. The culmination of these trends produced an economy that no longer resembled the one that built the American middle class. Instead of broad-based prosperity, the nation saw concentrated wealth at the top, fragile financial security in the middle, and rising economic stress at the bottom. The forces shaping this transition, globalization, automation, weakened labor power, rising costs, and stagnant wages, created an economic landscape where upward mobility became harder to achieve. The middle class that once symbolized stability and opportunity found itself in a slow and largely hidden collapse, overshadowed by narratives of growth that rarely reflected everyday reality. The illusion persisted because headline economic indicators, stock market performance, GDP growth, and corporate earnings painted a deceptively optimistic picture. But beneath the surface, a different story unfolded, one defined by shrinking opportunity, rising insecurity, and the erosion of the economic foundation that had supported generations. The decline of the American middle class was not sudden, nor was it widely acknowledged. It was a gradual unraveling, hidden behind decades of policy decisions and economic shifts that collectively transformed the nation's social and financial landscape. For the American middle class, the quiet stagnation of wages would have been difficult enough on its own. But what transformed this challenge into a full-scale economic squeeze was the relentless rise in living costs. Over the past several decades, essential goods and services, housing, healthcare, education, and transportation, increased in price far faster than incomes. This divergence created a growing gap between what families earned and what they needed to maintain a stable standard of living. Economists describe this phenomenon as a cost of living crisis, hidden in plain sight, one that reshaped the financial reality of millions of households and accelerated the decline of the middle class. Housing became the most visible pressure point. Across the country, home prices surged as demand outpaced supply, driven by demographic shifts, limited construction, speculative investment, and the concentration of economic opportunity in major metropolitan areas. In cities like San Francisco, New York, and Seattle, median home prices reached levels unattainable for middle-income workers. Even regions traditionally considered affordable began experiencing rapid appreciation. Rent followed the same trajectory, with monthly payments consuming an increasingly large share of household income. Analysts found that housing costs in many states grew at 2 to 3 times the rate of wage increases, forcing families to spend more on shelter while cutting back on savings and other expenses. Healthcare costs escalated just as dramatically. The United States already had the highest healthcare spending per capita in the world, and the burden fell disproportionately on the middle class. Insurance premiums rose year after year, deductibles increased, and out-of-pocket expenses climbed. Families found themselves paying more for routine medical care, prescription drugs, and emergency services. Studies revealed that a significant portion of Americans delayed medical treatment due to cost concerns, and many households incurred medical debt even with insurance coverage. Healthcare became not just a financial challenge, but a source of chronic insecurity, often pushing families into long-term debt or bankruptcy. Higher education, once considered the most reliable pathway to upward mobility, also became a major financial strain. Tuition at public and private colleges increased dramatically over the past several decades, rising far faster than inflation. As a result, students and their families turned to loans to cover costs. The total level of student debt grew into a national crisis, with millions of borrowers carrying obligations that affected their ability to buy homes, start families, or invest in the economy. Economists noted that the burden of education debt reduced long-term economic mobility and weakened the financial position of an entire generation. Transportation expenses added another layer of pressure. The rise in automobile prices, increased maintenance costs, and higher insurance premiums made vehicle ownership, essential for many workers without access to public transit, significantly more expensive. A surge in auto loan borrowing reflected this trend, with many households taking on long-term loans to manage monthly payments. When interest rates rose, financing costs increased even further, deepening the financial burden on families already struggling to keep up with other living expenses. Utilities and everyday essentials also contributed to the widening gap. The cost of electricity, heating, internet access, and groceries rose steadily, often outpacing wage growth. Global supply chain disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and inflationary pressures further increased prices, especially in the early 2020s. The impact was disproportionately felt by middle-income households, which earned too much to qualify for substantial government assistance, yet too little to absorb rising costs without consequence. Surveys showed that a majority of Americans reported financial stress related to basic expenses, even during periods of strong headline economic performance. Real wage stagnation amplified these challenges. While productivity increased significantly over several decades, median wages barely moved when adjusted for inflation. This disconnect meant that workers created more economic value, but received only a small share of the benefits. Analysts pointed to the declining power of labor unions, the rise of contract and gig work, and technological displacement as key factors. The shift toward flexible labor markets provided companies with cost savings and operational efficiencies, but it left workers with lower wages, fewer benefits, and less job security. For many, the promise of steady, predictable employment, once the hallmark of middle-class life, became increasingly difficult to achieve. Economic statistics highlighted the severity of the squeeze. Reports indicated that more than half of American households would struggle to cover an unexpected expense without borrowing. A large share lived paycheck to paycheck, regardless of income bracket. Families increasingly relied on credit cards to manage rising expenses, driving household debt to historic highs. Auto loan delinquencies rose, and medical debt remained a leading cause of personal bankruptcy. Financial advisors noted that a growing number of middle-class households lacked adequate savings, leaving them vulnerable to even minor disruptions. The pressure on families extended beyond finances, affecting mental health, family stability, and overall quality of life. Surveys revealed rising levels of stress, anxiety, and burnout associated with economic insecurity. Workers took on multiple jobs or extra shifts to keep up with expenses. Parents struggled to balance childcare costs with work schedules. Young adults postponed major life decisions due to financial uncertainty. These individual struggles collectively reflected a broader societal issue: the erosion of the economic stability that once defined the American middle class. International observers pointed out that while many developed countries faced rising living costs, the situation in the United States was uniquely severe because wage growth lagged behind more dramatically and social safety nets were comparatively limited. Critics argued that essential services such as healthcare and education were structurally unaffordable for large segments of the population. The result was an economic environment where progress felt increasingly out of reach, and where the basic expectation of improving one's standard of living became harder to fulfill. The widening gap between wages and costs represented not just a financial challenge, but a structural shift with long-term implications for the nation's social and economic fabric. Families stretched their budgets, relied on debt, and made difficult sacrifices simply to maintain stability. The promise of a secure middle-class lifestyle, once considered attainable with hard work and steady employment, became a distant prospect for many. As living expenses continued to rise, the pressure on the middle class deepened, revealing the true scale of an economic crisis that had been growing quietly for decades. For millions of American families, the rise of household debt did not begin as a crisis. It began as a lifeline. As wages stagnated and costs climbed, borrowing quietly replaced income as the mechanism that kept the middle class afloat. Credit cards, mortgages, auto loans, personal loans, and student debt gradually formed an invisible scaffolding around everyday life. What was once viewed as a tool for opportunity became, over time, the foundation of a financial system that depended on perpetual borrowing. Analysts began to warn that the American economy was increasingly powered not by real wage growth or savings, but by debt-fueled consumption, a cycle that held profound long-term consequences. Credit card borrowing was the earliest sign of the shift. In the late 20th century, credit cards were marketed as symbols of financial freedom, allowing families to smooth out expenses and weather unexpected costs. But as living expenses grew faster than wages, households relied on revolving credit to fill the gap. Interest rates on these cards remained high, ensuring that once balances accumulated, they became difficult to repay. By the early 21st century, analysts found that a significant share of American households carried ongoing credit card debt month after month, with many paying more in interest charges each year than they saved for emergencies. Financial advisors describe this as a debt treadmill, where families walked endlessly without making real progress. Mortgages represented another major shift in the debt landscape. Homeownership had long been considered the cornerstone of middle-class stability, yet rising property prices pushed families to borrow larger sums over longer terms. Adjustable-rate mortgages, interest-only loans, and low down payment products became common during the housing boom. When the housing market collapsed in the late 2000s, millions of families lost their homes or saw their equity disappear overnight. Despite the lessons of the crisis, housing affordability worsened in subsequent decades. As institutional investors and private equity firms entered the housing market, home prices climbed even further. Families took on increasingly burdensome mortgages, stretching their finances to the limit just to secure a place to live. Auto loans followed a similar trajectory. As vehicle prices rose, lenders introduced longer repayment terms, extending loans from traditional 3 or 4 year periods to 6 or 7 years. This allowed borrowers to manage monthly payments, but sharply increased the total amount of interest paid. Many households found themselves still repaying loans when their vehicles had already depreciated significantly. Analysts observed that auto loan delinquencies rose steadily, particularly among younger borrowers, reflecting broader financial fragility within the middle class. Student debt became one of the most defining and devastating features of the modern American economy. As tuition increased far beyond wage growth, borrowing became the only path to higher education for millions of young adults. This transformed student loans into a massive national burden. Borrowers frequently graduated with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and many carried these obligations well into middle age. Economists noted that the weight of student loans delayed homeownership, family formation, and long-term wealth building. The education system, once designed to create opportunity, became instead a mechanism that transferred financial risk onto individuals. Medical debt added yet another layer to the crisis. Even insured families often faced high deductibles, unexpected bills, and complex billing practices that left them owing thousands. Studies revealed that medical expenses remained one of the leading causes of personal bankruptcy. Households that suffered a major illness or emergency frequently experienced long-term financial fallout, regardless of their previous stability. The healthcare system, structured around private insurance and high out-of-pocket costs, became a uniquely American contributor to the middle-class debt trap. What made the debt crisis especially dangerous was not only the scale of borrowing, but the normalization of it. For many families, reliance on credit replaced the traditional model of saving for emergencies. Corporations, financial institutions, and policymakers encouraged this shift, portraying borrowing as both inevitable and beneficial. The rise of financial technology further accelerated the trend. Apps offered instant loans, buy now, pay later programs, and credit lines disguised as consumer conveniences. These tools made borrowing frictionless, but they also obscured the long-term consequences, especially for households already stretched thin. Economists described a growing divide within the middle class. Households with stable incomes and assets could use credit strategically, but millions of others used debt simply to survive. Surveys showed that a large share of Americans had less than a few $100s in savings, forcing them to rely on credit cards for basic needs. The number of families reporting that they lived one emergency away from crisis increased dramatically. The concept of financial security, once considered a defining feature of the American middle class, became increasingly out of reach. The psychology of debt also played a role. Borrowers experienced a constant tension between maintaining social expectations, home ownership, education, transportation, and confronting financial limits. Credit provided a temporary escape, masking the widening gap between incomes and expenses. Policymakers, meanwhile, often pointed to rising consumer spending as evidence of economic strength, ignoring the fact that much of it was driven by borrowing rather than real prosperity. The corporate side of the debt trap revealed another layer of complexity. Financial institutions increasingly depended on household borrowing for profits. Banks, credit card companies, and private lenders generated substantial revenue from interest payments, fees, and penalties. The financial sector's growth became intertwined with the indebtedness of ordinary Americans. This created a system where the struggles of the middle class produced the earnings of the financial elite. Critics argued that such an arrangement incentivized rising debt rather than addressing the structural issues behind it. International observers noted that the United States differed sharply from other developed nations. Many countries provided stronger social safety nets, universal health care, or subsidized education, reducing households' need to rely on debt. In contrast, the American middle class bore the cost of essential services largely on its own. As global economic conditions shifted, with inflation rising, interest rates increasing, and supply chain disruptions affecting prices, debt burdens became even heavier. The financial space where families once maneuvered narrowed significantly, leaving many without options when unexpected expenses arose. What emerged over time was not merely a debt-dependent economy, but a debt-conditioned society. The systems designed to support prosperity became tools of financial extraction. The very mechanisms that once promoted upward mobility now trapped families in perpetual repayment cycles. As borrowing replaced wage growth as the foundation of the middle class, the stability of the entire economic structure came into question. The deeper the United States fell into a debt-driven economic model, the more the middle class became intertwined with financial structures designed to extract value rather than create it. What began as individual borrowing slowly evolved into a nationwide dependency, where the health of the entire economy relied on households continuing to take on new debt. Economists warned that this model was fundamentally unstable, yet it persisted because it masked the consequences of wage stagnation and rising inequality. The more families borrowed, the more the system demanded. What emerged was a feedback loop. Stagnant incomes forced borrowing. Borrowing fueled economic growth. Growth justified political inaction, and inaction created the conditions for even greater indebtedness. One of the most alarming elements of this cycle was the rise of subprime lending, not only in mortgages, but across nearly every type of consumer credit. After the housing collapse of the late 2000s, regulators attempted to restrict high-risk mortgage products, but lenders simply shifted their focus. Subprime auto loans expanded rapidly, targeting buyers with limited credit histories and offering long-term repayment plans at high interest rates. The market for these loans was fueled by investor demand for asset-backed securities, echoing the packaging practices that contributed to the housing crisis. When delinquencies began rising, analysts noted uncomfortable parallels: households unable to keep up with payments, lenders approving risky loans despite warnings, and financial institutions bundling debt into opaque investment products. Credit card companies adopted similar strategies. As competition intensified, lenders increased fees, raised interest rates, and introduced complex terms that made repayment more difficult. Many households found themselves trapped by compounding interest, with balances growing even when they made regular payments. Financial journalists documented cases in which borrowers paid more in interest over a decade than the original amount they charged. Regulators attempted incremental reforms, but the fundamental business model, profiting from long-term indebtedness, remained intact. The explosive growth of personal loans added another layer to the crisis. Fintech companies offered quick approvals and minimal documentation, appealing to borrowers facing rising expenses or unexpected bills. These loans often carried high interest rates and short repayment periods. As more consumers struggled with credit card debt, they turned to personal loans as a temporary solution, only to find themselves juggling multiple obligations. Surveys showed that a growing share of Americans used one form of debt to pay off another, a clear sign of financial instability. Medical debt continued to push families into financial ruin. Hospitals and insurers often required upfront payments or billed patients for services at unpredictable rates. Even minor medical procedures could lead to substantial debt. Investigations revealed that collection agencies frequently pursued aggressive tactics, placing liens on homes, garnishing wages, and damaging credit scores. As the burden accumulated, millions of Americans avoided seeking medical care altogether, fearing long-term financial consequences. Public health experts warned that the economic pressures created a feedback loop where untreated medical issues led to greater long-term costs, both for households and for society. Student debt remained one of the most significant obstacles to middle-class stability. Borrowers who entered repayment during periods of weak job markets faced years of financial strain. Many were unable to buy homes, start families, or build savings. Economists noted that student loan balances often grew rather than shrank due to interest accumulation. A substantial number of borrowers made payments for years without reducing the principal balance. Researchers found that student debt contributed to the widening wealth gap between generations, with younger Americans holding unprecedented levels of financial liability compared to their parents at the same age. The debt trap extended into retirement planning as well. As pensions disappeared and employer-sponsored retirement plans shifted responsibility onto workers, families were expected to save substantial amounts for the future. But with wages stagnant and living costs rising, many were unable to contribute enough to retirement accounts. Some withdrew early to cover emergencies, incurring penalties and reducing long-term savings. Financial analysts warned that millions of Americans were on track to enter retirement with insufficient resources. Instead of reducing debt as they aged, many continued to carry mortgages, student loans, credit card balances, and even medical debt into their later years. Technological developments amplified these vulnerabilities. Algorithms used by lenders assess borrowers based on behavioral data, spending habits, and online activity. While marketed as innovations, these systems often entrenched inequality by penalizing individuals with irregular income or limited credit histories. Buy now, pay later services spread rapidly, offering consumers the illusion of affordability while quietly increasing total household debt. These platforms blurred the distinction between purchasing power and borrowing power, encouraging consumption even as economic pressures tightened. The macroeconomic implications became increasingly clear. Household debt played a critical role in sustaining consumer spending, which represented a significant portion of national GDP. Policymakers frequently pointed to strong spending as evidence of economic health, even when that spending was financed by credit. When interest rates rose, debt burdens intensified, reducing disposable income and increasing the likelihood of defaults. Economists warned that a heavily indebted middle class was less capable of absorbing economic shocks. Recessions, inflation spikes, or labor market disruptions could trigger widespread financial distress, undermining the stability of the broader economy. Financial inequality deepened as the burden of debt fell disproportionately on those least able to manage it. Wealthier households used credit selectively and often repaid balances quickly, avoiding long-term interest. Middle and lower income families, by contrast, used debt as a tool for survival. They borrowed for essential goods, emergency expenses, and living costs. This divergence created a system where interest payments flowed upward, transferring wealth from indebted households to financial institutions and affluent investors. Economists describe this as a structural redistribution mechanism, one that quietly extracted value from the middle class and concentrated it at the top. The psychological toll of this environment was immense. Studies showed rising levels of financial stress among Americans of all ages. Many reported feelings of hopelessness, anxiety, and loss of control. Workers juggled multiple jobs to meet obligations. Parents sacrificed personal well-being to maintain stability for their children. Young adults delayed major life milestones because long-term financial planning seemed impossible. The emotional strain became part of the broader narrative of middle-class decline, shaping political attitudes, cultural trends, and social behavior. Meanwhile, policymakers often failed to address the underlying causes. Debt relief programs were limited in scope, and broader reforms were hampered by political polarization. Efforts to regulate predatory lending encountered strong resistance from industry groups. Proposals to reduce education or healthcare costs stalled amid legislative gridlock. As a result, households continued to navigate a financial system designed around borrowing, with little prospect of structural improvement. The United States entered the 2020s with unprecedented levels of household debt. Families were more financially vulnerable than at any point in recent history. Multiple sectors, auto lending, credit cards, student loans, and medical finance, showed rising delinquencies. Analysts warned that even a mild recession could trigger a cascade of defaults. Yet despite these warnings, the debt machine continued operating, driven by the pressures of modern life and the economic structures that incentivize borrowing over stability. What emerged was a portrait of a nation where the middle class survived not through rising wages or secure employment, but through continuous indebtedness. Debt had become the defining feature of modern American life, a silent force shaping choices, limiting opportunities, and eroding the foundation of economic security. The debt trap was no longer a metaphor. It was the lived reality of millions, deeply embedded in the fabric of the economy, and central to understanding the hidden collapse of the American middle class. For generations, American families viewed wealth not as an abstract financial concept, but as something tangible: a home, a pension, a modest savings account, and perhaps some investment set aside for the future. These pillars created a sense of stability and upward mobility. But over the past several decades, the foundation of middle-class wealth has steadily eroded, reshaped by economic forces that transferred opportunity upward while leaving ordinary households increasingly vulnerable. What emerged was a new reality: the disappearance of wealth not through sudden catastrophe, but through slow structural decline. The housing market illustrates this transformation with brutal clarity. Homeownership was once the defining feature of middle-class life, yet rising prices pushed this dream further out of reach. As property values climbed faster than income, families were forced to take on larger mortgages or remain lifelong renters. In many regions, institutional investors and private equity firms began purchasing single-family homes in bulk, competing directly with middle-class buyers. These corporations, armed with vast capital reserves, accelerated price increases, and converted homes into long-term rental properties. Analysts observed that this shift fundamentally altered the housing landscape. Instead of building equity through ownership, many families now watched rents rise year after year, while the possibility of owning a home drifted farther away. Even those who successfully bought homes found their wealth more fragile than it appeared. Housing markets became increasingly volatile, vulnerable to interest rate changes, speculative behavior, and demographic shifts. Homeownership, once considered a reliable path to wealth, became a riskier proposition. A single downturn could wipe out years of equity, leaving families with debts greater than the value of their homes. The housing crash of the late 2000s demonstrated this vividly, and echoes of that crisis reappeared as affordability worsened in the decades that followed. Retirement wealth faced a parallel decline. Traditional pensions, which provided predictable income for retirees, were replaced by individual retirement accounts that shifted responsibility from employers to workers. This transition forced families to navigate complex financial markets with little guidance. Many contributed inconsistently due to financial pressures. Market volatility, recessions, and unexpected expenses eroded savings at critical moments. Studies revealed that a significant share of Americans reach retirement age with insufficient assets, often relying primarily on social benefits. For millions, the expectation of a stable retirement, once a cornerstone of middle-class security, became unattainable. Investment opportunities also became increasingly unequal. Wealthier households benefited from access to financial advisors, diversified portfolios, and tax-advantaged investment strategies. Middle-class families, by contrast, often had limited exposure to equities or relied on small retirement accounts vulnerable to market swings. During periods of economic growth, The wealthiest segments captured the majority of gains, widening the gap between the top and the rest. Economists documented that the top fraction of households came to hold a dramatically larger share of national wealth than ever before, while the middle class controlled a shrinking portion. The disappearance of savings added another layer to the crisis. Rising costs left families with little room to put money aside. Emergency funds dwindled, and unexpected expenses, medical bills, car repairs, home maintenance, frequently pushed households into debt. Surveys consistently showed that a majority of Americans lack sufficient savings to cover even modest emergencies. Without savings, long-term financial planning became almost impossible, leaving families vulnerable to economic shocks. Meanwhile, corporate ownership of essential assets intensified the imbalance. Investment firms accumulated vast portfolios of properties, farmland, infrastructure, and even water rights. These acquisitions concentrated economic power and extracted wealth from communities through rents, fees, and increased prices. Critics argued that this consolidation represented a quiet transfer of wealth from everyday Americans to large institutions, a shift that accelerated as financial markets expanded. The growing influence of corporate landlords reshaped housing affordability, while private investment funds gained control over sectors once dominated by small businesses or local owners. The stock market, often cited as a sign of national prosperity, revealed stark inequalities. While market indices reached record highs multiple times during the past decade, participation in the market remained limited among middle-income households. Wealth concentration meant that the majority of gains accrued to the top segment of investors. Households with limited or no exposure to equities did not benefit from bullish markets, yet they suffered when downturns affected employment, wages, and retirement accounts. This divergence created an economy where prosperity at the macro level masked hardship at the micro level. Inflation added additional pressure. As prices increased across essential categories, household budgets grew more strained. Savings eroded quickly, and investments failed to keep pace with the rising cost of living. Even when wage increases occurred, they often lagged behind inflation, reducing real purchasing power. Economic commentators describe the phenomenon as silent erosion, where wealth disappeared gradually rather than through dramatic loss. The intergenerational consequences became increasingly visible. Younger Americans entered adulthood carrying unprecedented levels of debt while facing lower economic mobility. Many remained unable to purchase homes, accumulate savings, or invest for the future. Meanwhile, older generations struggled with inadequate retirement resources. The traditional model in which each generation built upon the success of the previous one began to reverse. Analysts warned that the erosion of middle-class wealth threatened long-term economic growth, social stability, and political cohesion. International observers noted that this pattern distinguished the United States from other advanced economies. Several countries implemented policies to preserve middle-class wealth through affordable housing, universal healthcare, and stronger social safety nets. The United States, however, relied heavily on market-based systems that exposed households to greater financial risk. As inequality widened, wealth became increasingly concentrated among corporations and high-net-worth individuals, leaving the middle class with fewer assets and greater vulnerability. The disappearance of wealth was not merely an economic trend. It represented a fundamental shift in the American experience. The tools that once enabled prosperity, home ownership, stable employment, pension-based retirement, accessible education, no longer serve the same function. Instead of supporting upward mobility, they often trapped families in cycles of debt and insecurity. The collapse of middle-class wealth occurred quietly, without a single defining moment, but its consequences were profound. It altered the structure of the economy, reshaped social dynamics, and revealed a troubling truth. The American middle class was no longer the foundation of national prosperity, but a shrinking remnant struggling to maintain what previous generations once took for granted. The future of the United States without a stable middle class is not defined by a single crisis, but by a slow unraveling of economic and social structures that once held the nation together. For decades, policymakers, economists, and business leaders treated the middle class as a constant, an unshakable majority that would continue to drive consumption, sustain tax revenues, and anchor political life. But as wages stagnated, costs climbed, and wealth eroded, the foundation of that stability weakened. What emerges now is a portrait of a country at risk of profound transformation, where the collapse of the middle class could reshape everything from national growth to global influence. The American economy depends heavily on consumer spending, which historically accounted for a significant share of national output. Middle-class households, with their broad participation in the economy, once formed the backbone of this demand. But as financial pressures intensified, many families reduced discretionary spending and focused on essentials. Economic analysts warned that persistent financial strain across such a large segment of the population could dampen long-term growth. Without the purchasing power of a strong middle class, industries ranging from retail to housing to transportation face shrinking markets. This contraction threatens to slow innovation, limit business expansion, and reduce overall economic productivity. The housing market illustrates the risk vividly. When fewer households can afford homes, construction slows, local tax revenues decline, and community stability weakens. Neighborhoods with low home ownership rates often experience higher turnover, less investment, and weaker cohesion. If the middle class continues to shrink, entire regions may face prolonged stagnation, creating pockets of economic decline reminiscent of the post-industrial cities of the late 20th century. Wealth concentration among corporate landlords may further shift housing dynamics, reducing affordability and contributing to long-term social polarization. An economy with a diminishing middle class also becomes more vulnerable to shocks. Households with limited savings are less able to withstand job losses, medical emergencies, or financial disruptions. During economic downturns, this fragility can amplify the severity of recessions. If millions of families simultaneously reduce spending or default on debts, financial institutions face increased risk, markets destabilize, and recovery slows. Economists note that countries with strong middle classes typically weather downturns more effectively, providing resilience that the United States may increasingly lack. Political consequences are equally significant. The middle class has traditionally served as a stabilizing force in democratic societies, balancing the interests of the wealthy and the working poor. Its decline has contributed to rising polarization, distrust in institutions, and increased support for populist movements. As economic anxiety grows, political discourse becomes more fragmented, with competing narratives blaming globalization, automation, immigration, corporate consolidation, or government failure. This climate makes bipartisan policymaking difficult, hindering efforts to address structural issues. A weakened middle class may lead to an era of prolonged political instability, characterized by rapid policy swings and deep ideological divides. Social cohesion also suffers when economic inequality widens. Research shows that societies with large disparities in wealth experience greater levels of crime, lower life expectancy, and reduced social mobility. In the United States, these trends are already visible. Communities with shrinking middle-class populations report higher levels of stress, declining public services, and reduced educational outcomes. The sense of shared identity that once defined American life erodes as families drift further apart in economic reality. The traditional belief that each generation will fare better than the last has weakened, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty and frustration. Internationally, the implications are profound. The United States built its global influence not only on military power, but on economic strength, supported by a thriving middle class. As domestic inequality rises and economic stability weakens, the country's ability to project confidence abroad may diminish. Nations with more robust social systems may appear increasingly competitive. Analysts warn that long-term domestic weaknesses could undermine the United States' diplomatic leverage, reduce its ability to lead global economic initiatives, and weaken its position in international negotiations. The potential decline of American innovation is another concern. Historically, the United States produced groundbreaking technologies, research, and industries fueled by a large educated workforce with access to opportunity. But if education remains unaffordable and student debt continues to burden young adults, the talent pipeline may erode. A society where higher education is accessible only to the wealthy risks losing the creative and scientific dynamism that once set the nation apart. Economists caution that innovation flourishes in societies where broad segments of the population can pursue advanced skills without lifelong financial hardship. Despite these challenges, the future is not predetermined. Several potential paths exist. One possibility is a slow adaptation, in which policymakers introduce reforms to stabilize the middle class through improved access to education, healthcare, and housing. Investments in infrastructure, renewable energy, and emerging technologies could create new middle-income jobs, relieving some pressure. However, such reforms require political consensus and sustained commitment, both of which have been difficult to achieve in recent years. Another scenario is continued divergence, where inequality deepens and wealth becomes even more concentrated. In this outcome, the middle class shrinks further, leaving a polarized society divided between affluent elites and struggling households. Economic growth may continue at the top, but national resilience weakens. Social unrest becomes more likely, and long-term stability deteriorates. Some analysts warn that this path resembles the trajectories of countries that experience prolonged stagnation or political upheaval due to entrenched inequality. A third scenario involves economic shock, a recession, financial crisis, or major geopolitical event that exposes the fragility of indebted households and overextended markets. Such an event could accelerate the middle class collapse, forcing rapid changes in policy and economic structure. The effects would depend on the nature and scale of the crisis, but the aftermath could reshape the national economy for decades. What remains clear is that the American middle class is no longer the unassailable economic force it once was. Its decline has implications that extend far beyond household budgets, influencing politics, global influence, and the nation's long-term trajectory. The future depends on choices made now, choices about investment, policy, and the value placed on broad-based prosperity. Without action, the hidden collapse of the middle class may evolve into a defining crisis of the 21st century. And once the foundation erodes beyond a certain point, rebuilding it becomes exponentially more difficult. This collapse is not a warning. It is already happening. A nation built on middle-class stability now stands on a fractured foundation, propped up by debt, stripped of savings, and divided by inequality so deep it threatens the future of the economy itself. If the middle class falls, the country falls with it. Growth slows, politics fractures, global influence fades, and the dream that once defined America becomes a memory. This story is far from over. The cracks are widening, new pressures are forming, and the next crisis will not wait. If you want to understand the true forces shaping our world, the forces operating in silence, in secrecy, and in the shadows, stay with us. Stay prepared. Stay aware. Shadow Rewind continues.